Chapter 12. It must have been close on to 1 o'clock when we got below the island at last, and the raft did seem to go mighty slow. If a boat was to come along, we was going to take to the canoe and break for the Illinois shore, and it was well a boat didn't come, for we hadn't ever thought to put the gun in the canoe or a fishing line or anything to eat. We was in ruther too much of a sweat to think of so many things. It weren't good judgment to put everything on the raft. If the men went to the island, I just expect they found the campfire I built and watched it all night for Jim to come. Anyways, they stayed away from us, and if my building the fire never fooled them, it weren't no fault of mine. I played it as low down on them as I could. When the first streak of day began to show, we tied up to a towhead in a big bend on the Illinois side and hacked off cottonwood branches with the hatchet and covered up the raft with them so she looked like there had been a cave-in in the bank there. A towhead is a sandbar that has cottonwoods on it as thick as harrow teeth. We had mountains on the Missouri shore and heavy timber on the Illinois side, and the channel was down the Missouri shore at that place, so we weren't afraid of anybody running across us. We laid there all day and watched the rafts and steamboats spin down the Missouri shore and upbound steamboats fight the big river in the middle. I told Jim all about the time I had jabbering with that woman, and Jim said she was a smart one, and if she was to start after us herself, she wouldn't sit down and watch a campfire. No, sir, she'd fetch a dog. Well then, I said, why couldn't she tell her husband to fetch a dog? Jim said he bet she did think of it by the time the men was ready to start, and he believed they must have gone uptown to get a dog, and so they lost all that time, or else we wouldn't be here on a towhead 16 or 17 mile below the village. No, indeedy, we would be in that same old town again. So I said I didn't care what was the reason they didn't get us as long as they didn't. When it was beginning to come on dark, we poked our heads out of the cottonwood thicket and looked up and down and across. Nothing in sight. So Jim took up some of the top planks of the raft and built a snug wigwam to get under in blazing weather and rainy and to keep the things dry. Jim made a floor for the wigwam and raised it a foot or more above the level of the raft. So now the blankets and all the traps was out of reach of steamboat waves. Right in the middle of the wigwam, we made a layer of dirt about 5 or 6 inches deep with a frame around it to hold it to its place. This was to build a fire on in sloppy weather or chilly. The wigwam would keep it from being seen. We made an extra steering oar too, because one of the others might get broke on a snag or something. We fixed up a short forked stick to hang the old lantern on, because we must always light the lantern whenever we see a steamboat coming downstream to keep from getting run over. But we wouldn't have to light it for upstream boats unless we see we was in what they call a crossing. For the river was pretty high yet, very low banks being still a little underwater. So upbound boats didn't always run the channel, but hunted easy water. This second night we run between 7 and 8 hours, with a current that was making over 4 miles an hour. We catched fish and talked, and we took a swim now and then to keep off sleepiness. It was kind of solemn, drifting down the big, still river, laying on our backs, looking up at the stars. And we didn't ever feel like talking loud, and it weren't often that we laughed. Only a little kind of a low chuckle. We had mighty good weather as a general thing, and nothing ever happened to us at all, that night, nor the next, nor the next. Every night we passed towns, some of them away up on black hillsides, nothing but just a shiny bed of lights. Not a house could you see. The 5th night we passed St. Louis, and it was like the whole world lit up. In St. Petersburg, they used to say there was 20 or 30,000 people in St. Louis, but I never believed it till I see that wonderful spread of lights at 2 o'clock that still night. There weren't a sound there. Everybody was asleep. Every night now I used to slip ashore towards 10 o'clock at some little village and buy 10 or 15 cents worth of meal or bacon or other stuff to eat. And sometimes I lifted a chicken that weren't roosting comfortable and took him along. Pap always said, "Take a chicken when you get a chance, because if you don't want him yourself, you can easy find somebody that does, and a good deed ain't ever forgot." I never see Pap when he didn't want the chicken himself, but that is what he used to say anyway. Mornings before daylight, I slipped into cornfields and borrowed a watermelon, or a mushmelon, or a pumpkin, or some new corn, or things of that kind. Pap always said it weren't no harm to borrow things if you was meaning to pay them back some time. But the widow said it weren't anything but a soft name for stealing, and no decent body would do it. Jim said he reckoned the widow was partly right and Pap was partly right. So the best way would be for us to pick out 2 or 3 things from the list and say we wouldn't borrow them anymore. Then he reckoned it wouldn't be no harm to borrow the others. So we talked it over all one night, drifting along down the river, trying to make up our minds whether to drop the watermelons or the cantaloupes or the mushmelons or what. But towards daylight we got it all settled satisfactory and concluded to drop crab apples and pea simmons. We weren't feeling just right before that, but it was all comfortable now. I was glad the way it come out too, because crab apples ain't ever good, and the pea simmons wouldn't be ripe for 2 or 3 months yet. We shot a waterfowl now and then that got up too early in the morning or didn't go to bed early enough in the evening. Take it all round, we lived pretty high. The 5th night below St. Louis, we had a big storm after midnight, with a power of thunder and lightning, and the rain poured down in a solid sheet. We stayed in the wigwam and let the raft take care of itself. When the lightning glared out, we could see a big straight river ahead, and high, rocky bluffs on both sides. By and by, says I, "Hello, Jim, looky yonder." It was a steamboat that had killed herself on a rock. We was drifting straight down for her. The lightning showed her very distinct. She was leaning over with part of her upper deck above water, and you could see every little chimbly guy clean and clear, and a chair by the big bell, with an old slouch hat hanging on the back of it when the flashes come. Well, it being away in the night and stormy and all so mysterious-like, I felt just the way any other boy would have felt when I see that wreck laying there so mournful and lonesome in the middle of the river. I wanted to get aboard of her and slink around a little and see what there was there. So I says, "Lee's land on her, Jim." But Jim was dead against it at first. He says, "I don't want to go foolin' long or no rack. We's doing blame well, and we better let blame well alone, as the good book says, like as not days a watchman on dat rack." "Watchman your grandmother," I says. "There ain't nothing to watch but the Texas and the pilot house. And do you reckon anybody's going to risk his life for a Texas and a pilot house such a night as this, when it's likely to break up and wash off down the river any minute?" Jim couldn't say nothing to that, so he didn't try. "And besides," I says, "we might borrow something worth having out of the captain's stateroom. Cigars, I bet you, and cost 5 cents apiece, solid cash. Steamboat captains is always rich and get $60 a month, and they don't care a cent what a thing costs, you know, long as they want it. Stick a candle in your pocket. I can't rest, Jim, till we give her a rummaging. Do you reckon Tom Sawyer would ever go buy this thing? Not for pie, he wouldn't. He'd call it an adventure, that's what he'd call it, and he'd land on that wreck if it was his last act. And wouldn't he throw style into it? Wouldn't he spread himself, nor nothing? Why, you'd think it was Christopher Columbus discovering Kingdom Come. I wish Tom Sawyer was here." Jim, he grumbled a little, but give in. He said we mustn't talk any more than we could help, and then talk mighty low. The lightning showed us the wreck again just in time, and we fetched the starboard derrick and made fast there. The deck was high out here. We went sneaking down the slope of it to larboard in the dark, towards the Texas, feeling our way slow with our feet, and spreading our hands out to fend off the guys, for it was so dark we couldn't see no sign of them. Pretty soon we struck the forward end of the skylight and clumb onto it, and the next step fetched us in front of the captain's door, which was open, and by Jiminy, away down through the Texas hall we see a light, and all in the same second we seemed to hear low voices in yonder. Jim whispered and said he was feeling powerful sick and told me to come along. I says, all right, and was going to start for the raft, But just then I heard a voice wail out and say, "Oh, please don't, boys. I swear I won't ever tell." Another voice said pretty loud, "It's a lie, Jim Turner. You've acted this way before. You always want more than your share of the truck, and you've always got it too, because you've sworn if you didn't you'd tell. But this time you've said it just one time too many. You're the meanest, treacherousest hound in this country." By this time Jim was gone for the raft. I was just a-biling with curiosity, and I says to myself, Tom Sawyer wouldn't back out now, and so I won't either. I'm a-going to see what's going on here. So I dropped on my hands and knees in the little passage and crept aft in the dark till there weren't but one stateroom betwixt me and the cross hall of the Texas. Then and there I see a man stretched on the floor and tied hand and foot, and two men standing over him, and one of them had a dim lantern in his hand, and the other one had a pistol. This one kept pointing the pistol at the man's head on the floor and saying, "I'd like to, and I order to, a mean skunk." The man on the floor would shrivel up and say, "Oh, please don't, Bill. I ain't ever going to tell." And every time he said that, the man with the lantern would laugh and say, "Deed you ain't. You never said no truer thing than that, you bet you." And once he said, "Hear him beg. And yet, if we hadn't got the best of him and tied him, he'd 'a' killed us both. And what for? Just for nothing. Just because we stood on our rights. That's what for. But I lay you ain't a-going to threaten nobody anymore, Jim Turner. Put up that pistol, Bill." Bill says, "I don't want to, Jake Packard. I'm for killing him. And didn't he kill old Hatfield just the same way, and don't he deserve it? But I don't want him killed, and I've got my reasons for it." "Bless your heart for them words, Jake Packard. I'll never forget you long's I live," says the man on the floor, sort of blubbering. Packard didn't take no notice of that, but hung up his lantern on a nail and started towards where I was there in the dark, and motioned Bill to come. I crawfished as fast as I could, about 2 yards, but the boat slanted so that I couldn't make very good time. So to keep from getting run over and catched, I crawled into a stateroom on the upper side. The man came a-pawing along in the dark, and when Packard got to my stateroom, he says, "Here, come in here." And in he come, and Bill after him. But before they got in, I was up in the upper berth, cornered, and sorry I come. Then they stood there, with their hands on the ledge of the berth, and talked. I couldn't see them, but I could tell where they was by the whiskey they'd been having. I was glad I didn't drink whiskey, but it wouldn't made much difference anyway, because most of the time they couldn't treat me because I didn't breathe. I was too scared. And besides, a body couldn't breathe and hear such talk. They talked low and earnest. Bill wanted to kill Turner. He says, "He said he'll tell, and he will. If we was to give both our shares to him, now it wouldn't make no difference after the row and the way we've served him. Shore's you're born. He'll turn state's evidence. Now you hear me. I'm for putting him out of his troubles." "So'm I," says Packard, very quiet. "Blame it. I'd sort of begun to think you wasn't. Well then, that's all right. Lee's go and do it." "Hold on a minute. I ain't had my say yet. You listen to me. Shooting's good, but there's quieter ways if the thing's got to be done. But what I say is this. It ain't good sense to go courting around after a halter if you can get at what you're up to in some way. That's just as good, and at the same time don't bring you into no risks. Ain't that so?" "You bet it is. But how you going to manage it this time?" "Well, my idea is this. We'll rustle around and gather up whatever pickings we've overlooked in the staterooms and shove for shore and hide the truck. Then we'll wait. Now I say, it ain't a-going to be more'n 2 hours before this wrack breaks up and washes off down the river. See? He'll be drownded and won't have nobody to blame for it but his own self. I reckon that's a considerable sight better'n killing of him. I'm unfavorable to killing a man as long as you can get around it. It ain't good sense. It ain't good morals. Ain't I right?" "Yes, I reckon you are. But suppose she don't break up and wash off?" "Well, we can wait the 2 hours anyway and see, can't we?" "All right then, come along." So they started and I lit out, all in a cold sweat, and scrambled forward. It was dark as pitch there, but I said in a kind of a coarse whisper, "Jim." And he answered up, right at my elbow with a sort of a moan, and I says, "Quick, Jim, it ain't no time for fooling around and moaning. There's a gang of murderers in yonder, and if we don't hunt up their boat and set her drifting down the river so these fellows can't get away from the wreck, there's one of them going to be in a bad fix. But if we find their boat, we can put all of them in a bad fix, for the sheriff will get them. Quick, hurry. I'll hunt the larboard side. You hunt the starboard. You start at the raft and—" Oh my lordy, RAF? They ain't no raft no mo. She done broke loose and gone, and here we is. Chapter 13. Well, I catched my breath and most fainted. Shut up on a wreck with such a gang as that. But it weren't no time to be sentimentering. We'd got to find that boat now, had to have it for ourselves. So we went a-quaking and shaking down the starboard side, and slow work it was, too. Seemed a week before we got to the stern. No sign of a boat. Jim said he didn't believe he could go any further. So scared he hadn't hardly any strength left, he said. But I said, "Come on, if we get left on this wreck we are in a fix, sure." So on we prowled again. We struck for the stern of the Texas and found it, and then scrabbled along forwards on the skylight, hanging on from shutter to shutter, for the edge of the skylight was in the water. When we got pretty close to the cross-hall door, there was the skiff, sure enough. I could just barely see her. I felt ever so thankful. In another second I would been aboard of her, but just then the door opened. One of the men stuck his head out only about a couple of foot from me, and I thought I was gone. But he jerked it in again and says, "Heave that blame lantern out of sight, Bill." He flung a bag of something into the boat and then got in himself and sat down. It was Packard. Then Bill. He come out and got in. Packard says in a low voice, "All ready. Shove off." I couldn't hardly hang on to the shutters, I was so weak. But Bill says, "Hold on, did you go through him?" "No. Didn't you?" "No. So he's got his share of the cash yet." "Well then, come along. No use to take truck and leave money." "Say, won't he suspicion what we're up to?" "Maybe he won't, but we gotta have it anyway. Come along." So they got out and went in. The door slammed to because it was on the careened side, and in a half second I was in the boat and Jim come tumbling after me. I out with my knife and cut the rope, and away we went. We didn't touch an oar, and we didn't speak nor whisper, nor hardly even breathe. We went gliding swift along, dead silent, past the tip of the paddle box and past the stern. Then, in a second or two more, we was 100 yards below the wreck, and the darkness soaked her up, every last sign of her, and we was safe, and knowed it. When we was 300 or 400 yards downstream, we see the lantern show like a little spark at the Texas door for a second, and we knowed by that the rascals had missed their boat, and was beginning to understand that they was in just as much trouble now as Jim Turner was. Then Jim manned the oars, and we took out after our raft. Now was the first time that I begun to worry about the men. I reckon I hadn't had time to before. I begun to think how dreadful it was, even for murderers to be in such a fix. I says to myself, there ain't no telling but I might come to be a murderer myself yet, and then how would I like it? So says I to Jim, the first light we see will land 100 yards below it or above it, in a place where it's a good hiding place for you and the skiff, and then I'll go and fix up some kind of a yarn, and get somebody to go for that gang and get them out of their scrapes so they can be hung when their time comes. But that idea was a failure, for pretty soon it begun to storm again, and this time worse than ever. The rain poured down and never a light showed. Everybody in bed, I reckon. We boomed along down the river, watching for lights and watching for our raft. After a long time the rain let up, but the clouds stayed, and the lightning kept whimpering, and by a flash showed us a black thing ahead, floating, and we made for it. It was the raft, and mighty glad was we to get aboard of it again. We seen a light now away down to the right, on shore, so I said I would go for it. The skiff was half full of plunder which that gang had stole there on the wreck. We hustled it on to the raft in a pile, and I told Jim to float along down and show a light when he judged he had gone about 2 miles and keep it burning till I come. Then I manned my oars and shoved for the light. As I got down towards it, 3 or 4 more showed up on a hillside. It was a village. I closed in above the shore light and laid on my oars and floated. As I went by, I see it was a lantern hanging on the jackstaff of a double-hull ferry boat. I skimmed around for the watchman, wondering whereabouts he slept, and by I found him roosting on the bitts forward with his head down between his knees. I gave his shoulder 2 or 3 little shoves and begun to cry. He stirred up in a kind of a startlish way, but when he see it was only me, he took a good gap and stretch, and then he says, "Hello, what's up? Don't cry, bub. What's the trouble?" I says, "Pap and ma'am and sis and..." Then I broke down. He says, "Oh, dang it now, don't take on so. We all has to have our troubles and this'll come out all right. What's the matter with them?" Are you the watchman of the boat?" "Yes," he says, kind of pretty well satisfied like. "I'm the captain and the owner and the mate and the pilot and watchman and head deckhand, and sometimes I'm the freight and passengers. I ain't as rich as old Jim Hornback, and I can't be so blamed generous and good to Tom, Dick, and Harry as what he is, and slam around money the way he does. But I've told him a many a time I wouldn't trade places with him, for, says I, a sailor's life's the life for me, and I'm derned if I'd live 2 mile out of town, where there ain't nothing ever going on, not for all his spondulics and as much more on top of it." Says I broke in and says, "They're in an awful peck of trouble, and..." "Who is?" "Why, Pap and Ma'am and Sis and Miss Hooker, and if you'd take your ferry boat and go up there." "Up where? Where are they?" "On the wreck." "What wreck?" "Why, there ain't but one." "What, you don't mean the Walter Scott?" "Yes." "Good land. What are they doing there, for gracious sakes?" "Well, they didn't go there a purpose." "I bet they didn't. Why, great goodness, there ain't no chance for 'em if they don't get off mighty quick. Why, how in the nation did they ever get into such a scrape?" "Easy enough. Miss Hooker was a visiting up there to the town." "Yes, Booth's Landing. Go on." "She was a visiting there at Booth's Landing, and just in the edge of the evening she started over with her nigger woman in the horse ferry to stay all night at her friend's house, Miss what you may call her, I disremember her name, and they lost their steering oar and swung around and went a-floating down, stern first about 2 mile, and saddlebagsed on the wreck, and the ferryman and the nigger woman and the horses was all lost, but Miss Hooker she made a grab and got aboard the wreck. Well, about an hour after dark we come along down in our trading scow, and it was so dark we didn't notice the wreck till we was right on it, and so we saddlebagsed, but all of us was saved but Bill Whipple, and oh, he was the best creetur. I most wished it had been me, I do. My George, it's the beatin'est thing I ever struck. And then what did you all do?" "Well, we hollered and took on, but it's so wide there we couldn't make nobody hear. So Pap said somebody got to get ashore and get help somehow. I was the only one that could swim, so I made a dash for it, and Miss Hooker she said if I didn't strike help sooner, come here and hunt up her uncle, and he'd fix the thing. I made the land about a mile below and been fooling along ever since, trying to get people to do something, but they said, 'What? In such a night and such a current? There ain't no sense in it. Go for the steam ferry.' Now if you'll go, and by Jackson, I'd like to, and blame it. I don't know, but I will. But who in the dingnation's a going to pay for it? Do you reckon your Pap?" "Why, that's all right. Miss Hooker she told me, particular, that her Uncle Hornback." "Great guns! Is he your uncle? Looky here, you break for that light over yonder way and turn out west when you get there, and about a quarter of a mile out you'll come to the tavern. Tell him to dart you out to Jim Hornback's and he'll foot the bill. And don't you fool around any, because he'll want to know the news. Tell him I'll have his niece all safe before he can get to town. Hump yourself now. I'm a-going up around the corner here to roust out my engineer." I struck for the light, but as soon as he turned the corner, I went back and got into my skiff and bailed her out, and then pulled up shore in the easy water about 600 yards and tucked myself in among some wood boats, for I couldn't rest easy till I could see the ferry boat start. But take it all around, I was feeling ruther comfortable on accounts of taking all this trouble for that gang, for not many would have done it. I wished the widow knowed about it. I judged she would be proud of me for helping these rapscallions, because rapscallions and dead beats is the kind the widow and good people takes the most interest in. Well, before long here comes the wreck, dim and dusky, sliding along down. A kind of cold shiver went through me, and then I struck out for her. She was very deep, and I see in a minute there weren't much chance for anybody being alive in her. I pulled all around her and hollered a little, but there wasn't any answer. All dead still. I felt a little bit heavy-hearted about the gang, but not much, for I reckoned if they could stand it, I could. Then here comes the ferry boat, so I shoved for the middle of the river on a long downstream slant, and when I judged I was out of eye reach, I laid on my oars and looked back and see her go and smell around the wreck for Miss Hooker's remainders, because the captain would know her Uncle Hornback would want them. And then pretty soon the ferry boat give it up and went for the shore, and I laid into my work and went a-booming down the river. It did seem a powerful long time before Jim's light showed up, and when it did show, it looked like it was 1,000 miles off. By the time I got there, the sky was beginning to get a little gray in the east. So we struck for an island and hid the raft and sunk the skiff and turned in and slept like dead people. Chapter 14. By and by, when we got up, we turned over the truck the gang had stole off of the wreck and found boots and blankets and clothes and all sorts of other things, and a lot of books and a spyglass and 3 boxes of cigars. We hadn't ever been this rich before in neither of our lives. The cigars was prime. We laid off all the afternoon in the woods talking and me reading the books and having a general good time. I told Jim all about what happened inside the wreck and at the ferry boat, and I said these kinds of things was adventures, but he said he didn't want no more adventures. He said that when I went into Texas and he crawled back to get on the raft and found her gone, he nearly died because he judged it was all up with him anyway it could be fixed. For if he didn't get saved, he would get drowned. And if he did get saved, whoever saved him would send him back home so as to get the reward. And then Miss Watson would sell him south, sure. Well, he was right. He was most always right. He had an uncommon level head for a nigger. I read considerable to Jim about kings and dukes and earls and such, and how gaudy they dressed, and how much style they put on, and called each other your majesty, and your grace, and your lordship, and so on, 'stead of mester. And Jim's eyes bugged out, and he was interested. He says, "I didn't know dey was so many I hain't hearn 'bout none scasely, but old King Solomon, unless you counts them kings that's in a packer kyards. How much do a king get?" "Get?" I says. "Why, they get $1,000 a month if they want it. They can have just as much as they want. Everything belongs to them." "Ain't that gay? And what they gotta do, Huck?" "They don't do nothing. Why, how you talk. They just sit around." "No, is that so?" "Of course it is. They just sit around. Except, maybe, when there's a war, then they go to the war. But other times they just lazy around, or go hawking. Just hawking and spesh. Do you hear a noise?" We skipped out and looked, but it weren't nothing but the flutter of a steamboat's wheel away down, coming around the point. So we come back. "Yes," says I, "and other times, when things is dull, they fuss with the Parliament. And if everybody don't go just so he whacks their heads off, but mostly they hang round the harem." "Round to which?" "Harem." "What's the harem?" "The place where he keeps his wives. Don't you know about the harem? Solomon had one. He had about 1,000,000 wives." "Why, yes, that's so. I done forgot it. A harem's a bodin' house, I reckon. Most likely they has rackety times in the nussery. And I reckon the wives quarrels considerable, and that creased the racket. Yet they say Solomon the wisest man that ever live. I don't take no stock in that. Because why? Would a wise man want to live in the midst or sich a blim-blamin' all the time? No, deed he wouldn't. A wise man you'd take and build a biler factory. On then he could shut down the biler factory when he want to rease. Well, but he was the wisest man anyway, because the widow she told me so, her own self. I don't care what the widder say, he warn't no wise man nother. He had some air to dad fachades ways I ever see. Does you know about that chile that he was gwine to chop in two? Yes, the widow told me all about it. Well then, warned that the beatin' is notion in the world? You just take and look at it a minute. Da's the stump, that's one of the women. Has you, that's the youther one. I's Solomon, and dish your dollar bills the chile. Bofe you claims it. What does I do? Does I shin around mongs the neighbors and find out which you the bill do belong to, and hunt it over to the right one, all safe and sound, the way that anybody that had any gumption would? No, I take and whack the bill in two and give half on it to you, on the youther half to the youther woman. That's the way Solomon was gwine to do with the chile. Now I want to ask you, what's the use ere that half a bill? Can't buy nothing wide it. And what use is a half a chile? I wouldn't give a dern for a million But hang it, Jim. You've clean missed the point. Blame it. You've missed it 1,000 mile. Who? Me? Go long. Don't talk to me about your pints. I reckon I knows sense when I sees it, and they ain't no sense in sich doin's as dat. Dispute weren't 'bout a half a chile, dispute was 'bout a whole chile. And the man that think he can settle a dispute 'bout a whole chile with a half a chile don't know enough to come in out in the rain. Don't talk to me 'bout Solomon, Huck. I knows him by the back. But I tell you, you don't get the point. Blame the point. I reckon I knows what I knows. And mind you, the real pint is down further, it's down deeper. It lays in the way Solomon was raised. You take a man that's got only one or two chillin'. Is that man gwine to be wasteful of chillin'? No, he ain't. He can't afford it. He know how to value 'em. But you take a man that's got 'bout 5 million chillin' running round the house, and it's defunt. He as soon chop a chile in two as a cat. Dey's plenty mo. A chile or two, mo or less, weren't no consequence to Solomon. Dad fetch him. I never see such a nigger. If he got a notion in his head once, there weren't no getting it out again. He was the most down on Solomon of any nigger I ever see. So I went to talking about other kings and let Solomon slide. I told about Louis XVI that got his head cut off in France long time ago, and about his little boy, the Dolphin, that would have been a king, but they took and shut him up in jail, and some say he died there. Po little chap. But some says he got out and got away and come to America. That's good, but he'll be pooty lonesome. They ain't no kings here, is they, Huck? No. Then he can't get no situation. What he gwine to do? Well, I don't know. Some of them gets on the police, and some of them learns people how to talk French. Why, Huck? Don't the French people talk the same way we does? No, Jim. You couldn't understand a word they said. Not a single word. Well, now I be ding-busted. How did that come? I don't know, but it's so. I got some of their jabber out of a book. Suppose a man was to come to you and say, "Parlez-vous Franzi," what would you think? I wouldn't think nothing. I'd take and bust him over the head. Dat is, if he warn't white. I wouldn't low no nigger to call me dat. Shucks, it ain't calling you anything. It's only saying, do you know how to talk French? Well then, why couldn't he say it? Why, he is a-saying it. That's a Frenchman's way of saying it. Well, it's a blame ridiculous way, and I don't want to hear no mo' about it. They ain't no sense in it. Looky here, Jim. Does a cat talk like we do? No, a cat don't. Well, does a cow? No, a cow don't nother. Does a cat talk like a cow or a cow talk like a cat? No, they don't. It's natural and right for 'em to talk different from each other, ain't it? Course. And ain't it natural and right for a cat and a cow to talk different from us? Why, most surely it is. Well then, why ain't it natural and right for a Frenchman to talk different from us? You answer me that. Is a cat a man, Huck? No. Well then, they ain't no sense in a cat talking like a man. Is a cow a man? Or is a cow a cat? No, she ain't either of them. Well then, she ain't got no business to talk like either one or the either of 'em. Is a Frenchman a man? Yes. Well then, dad blame it, why don't he talk like a man? You answer me dat. I see it weren't no use wasting words. You can't learn a nigger to argue. So I quit. Chapter 15. We judged that 3 nights more would fetch us to Cairo at the bottom of Illinois, where the Ohio River comes in, and that was what we was after. We would sell the raft and get on a steamboat and go way up the Ohio amongst the free states, and then be out of trouble. Well, the second night a fog begun to come on, and we made for a towhead to tie to, for it wouldn't do to try to run in a fog. But when I paddled ahead in the canoe with the line to make fast, there weren't anything but little saplings to tie to. I passed the line around one of them right on the edge of the cut bank, but there was a stiff current, and the raft come booming down so lively she tore it out by the roots, and away she went. I see the fog closing down, and it made me so sick and scared I couldn't budge for most a half a minute, it seemed to me. And then there weren't no raft in sight. You couldn't see 20 yards. I jumped into the canoe and run back to the stern and grabbed the paddle and set her back a stroke. But she didn't come. I was in such a hurry I hadn't untied her. I got up and tried to untie her, but I was so excited my hands shook so I couldn't hardly do anything with them. As soon as I got started, I took out after the raft, hot and heavy, right down the towhead. That was all right as far as it went, but the towhead weren't 60 yards long, and the minute I flew by the foot of it, I shot out into the solid white fog and hadn't no more idea which way I was going than a dead man. Thinks I, it won't do to paddle. First I know I'll run into the bank or a towhead or something. I gotta set still and float, and yet it's mighty fidgety business to have to hold your hand still at such a time. I whooped and listened. Away down there somewheres I hears a small whoop, and up comes my spirits. I went tearing after it, listening sharp to hear it again. The next time it come, I see I weren't heading for it, but heading away to the right of it. And the next time I was heading away to the left of it, and not gaining on it much either, for I was flying around, this way and that and t'other, but it was going straight ahead all the time. I did wish the fool would think to beat a tin pan, and beat it all the time, but he never did, and it was the still places between the whoops that was making the trouble for me. Well, I fought along, and directly I hears the whoop behind me. I was tangled good now. That was somebody else's whoop, or else I was turned around. I throwed the paddle down. I heard the whoop again. It was behind me yet, but in a different place. It kept coming, and kept changing its place, and I kept answering, till by and by it was in front of me again. And I knowed the current had swung the canoe's head downstream, and I was all right if that was Jim and not some other raftsman hollering. I couldn't tell nothing about voices in a fog, for nothing don't look natural nor sound natural in a fog. The whooping went on, and in about a minute I come a-booming down on a cut bank with smoky ghosts of big trees on it, and the current throwed me off to the left and shot by, amongst a lot of snags that fairly roared. The current was tearing by them so swift. In another second or two it was solid white and still again. I sat perfectly still then, listening to my heart thump, and I reckon I didn't draw a breath while it thumped 100. I just give up then. I knowed what the matter was. That cut bank was an island, and Jim had gone down t'other side of it. It weren't no towhead that you could float by in 10 minutes. It had the big timber of a regular island. It might be 5 or 6 miles long and more than half a mile wide. I kept quiet, with my ears cocked, about 15 minutes, I reckon. I was floating along, of course, 4 or 5 miles an hour, but you don't ever think of that. No, you feel like you are laying dead still on the water, and if a little glimpse of a snag slips by, you don't think to yourself how fast you're going, but you catch your breath and think, my, how that snag's tearing along. If you think it ain't dismal and lonesome out in a fog that way by yourself in the night, you try it once, you'll see. Next, for about a half an hour, I whoops now and then. At last, I hears the answer a long ways off and tries to follow it, but I couldn't do it. And directly I judged I'd got into a nest of towheads, for I had little dim glimpses of them on both sides of me. Sometimes just a narrow channel between, and some that I couldn't see I knowed was there because I'd hear the wash of the current against the old dead brush and trash that hung over the banks. Well, I weren't long loosing the whoops down amongst the towheads, and I only tried to chase them a little while anyway, because it was worse than chasing a jack-o'-lantern. You never know to sound dodge around so, and swap places so quick and so much. I had to claw away from the bank pretty lively 4 or 5 times to keep from knocking the islands out of the river, and so I judged the raft must be butting into the bank every now and then, or else it would get further ahead and clear out of hearing. It was floating a little faster than what I was. Well, I seemed to be in the open river again by and by, but I couldn't hear no sign of a whoop nowheres. I reckon Jim had fetched up on a snag, maybe, and it was all up with him. I was good and tired, so I laid down in the canoe and said I wouldn't bother no more. I didn't want to go to sleep, of course, but I was so sleepy I couldn't help it, so I thought I would take just one little cat nap. But I reckon it was more than a cat nap, for when I waked up the stars was shining bright, the fog was all gone, and I was spinning down a big bend stern first. First, I didn't know where I was. I thought I was dreaming, and when things began to come back to me, they seemed to come up dim out of last week. It was a monstrous big river here, with the tallest and the thickest kind of timber on both banks, just a solid wall as well as I could see by the stars. I looked away downstream and seen a black speck on the water. I took after it, but when I got to it, it weren't nothing but a couple of saw logs made fast together. Then I see another speck, and chase that, then another, and this time I was right. It was the raft. When I got to it, Jim was sitting there with his head down between his knees, asleep, with his right arm hanging over the steering oar. The other oar was smashed off, and the raft was littered up with leaves and branches and dirt, so she'd had a rough time. I made fast and laid down under Jim's nose on the raft and began to gap and stretch my fists out against Jim and says, "Hello, Jim, have I been asleep? Why didn't you stir me up?" "Goodness gracious, is dat you, Huck? And you ain't dead, you ain't drownded, you's back again? It's too good for true, honey, it's too good for true. Let me look at you, Chilly, let me feel of you. No, you ain't dead, you's back again, live and sound. Just the same old Huck, the same old Huck, thanks to goodness." "What's the matter with you, Jim? You been a-drinking?" "Drinking? Has I been a-drinking? Has I had a chance to be a-drinking?" "Well then, what makes you talk so wild?" "How does I talk wild?" "How? Why, hain't you been talking about my coming back and all that stuff as if I'd been gone away?" Huck Finn, you look me in the eye. Look me in the eye. Hain't you been gone away?" "Gone away? Why, what in the nation do you mean? I hain't been gone anywheres. Where would I go to?" "Well, looky here, boss. Dey's somethin' wrong, dey is. Is I me, or who is I? Is I here, or why is I? Now that's what I wants to know." "Well, I think you're here plain enough, but I think you're a tangle-headed old fool, Jim." "I is I? Well, you answer me dis. Didn't you tote out de line in de canoe for to make FAS to de towhead?" "No, I didn't. What towhead? I hain't seen no towhead." "You hain't seen no towhead? Looky here. Didn't de line pull loose on de raft go a-hummin' down de river, on leave you on de canoe behind in de fog?" "What fog?" "Why, de fog. The fog that's been around all night. And didn't you whoop? And didn't I whoop? Till we got mixed up into islands in one. On us got lost in t'other. One was just as good as lost. Case he didn't know what he was. And didn't I bust up again a lot of them islands and have a terrible time and most get drowned? Now ain't that so, boss? Ain't it so? You answer me dat. Well, this is too many for me, Jim. I hain't seen no fog, nor no islands, nor no troubles, nor nothing. I've been sitting here talking with you all night till you went to sleep about 10 minutes ago, and I reckon I done the same. You couldn't have got drunk in that time, so of course you've been dreaming. Dad fetch it. How was I gwine to dream all dat in 10 minutes? Well, hang it all. You did dream it, because there didn't any of it happen. But Huck, it's all just as plain to me as, it don't make no difference how plain it is. There ain't nothing in it. I know, because I've been here all the time. Jim didn't say nothing for about 5 minutes, but sat there studying over it. Then he says, well, den, I reckon I did dream it, Huck. But dog my cats, EF, it ain't the powerfulest dream I ever see. And I hain't ever had no dream before that's tired me like this one. Oh well, that's all right, because a dream does tire a body like everything sometimes. But this one was a staving dream. Tell me all about it, Jim. So Jim went to work and told me the whole thing right through, just as it happened, only he painted it up considerable. Then he said he must start in and interpret it, because it was sent for a warning. He said the first towhead stood for a man that would try to do us some good, but the current was another man that would get us away from him. The whoops was warnings that would come to us every now and then, and if we didn't try hard to make out to understand them, they'd just take us into bad luck, instead of keeping us out of it. The lot of towheads was troubles we was going to get into with quarrelsome people and all kinds of mean folks. But if we minded our business and didn't talk back and aggravate them, we would pull through and get out of the fog and into the big clear river, which was the Free States, and wouldn't have no more trouble. It had clouded up pretty dark just after I got onto the raft, but it was clearing up again now. Oh well, that's all interpreted well enough as far as it goes, Jim, I says. But what does these things stand for? It was the leaves and rubbish on the raft and the smashed oar. You could see them first rate now. Jim looked at the trash and then looked at me, and back at the trash again. He had got the dream fixed so strong in his head that he couldn't seem to shake it loose and get the facts back into its place again right away. But when he did get the thing straightened around, he looked at me steady without ever smiling and says, what did they stand for? I's gwine to tell you. When I got all wore out wid work, in wid the callin' for you, and went to sleep, my heart was most broke because you was lost, and I didn't care no more what becomer me and the raft. And when I wake up and find you back again, all safe and sound, the tears come, and I could have got down on my knees and kissed your foot. I's so thankful. And all you was thinking about was how you could make a fool of old Jim with a lie. That truck dies trash. And trash is what people is that puts dirt on the head or they friends and makes 'em ashamed. Then he got up slow and walked to the wigwam and went in there without saying anything but that. But that was enough. It made me feel so mean I could almost kissed his foot to get him to take it back. It was 15 minutes before I could work myself up to go and humble myself to a nigger, but I done it, and I weren't ever sorry for it afterwards neither. I didn't do him no more mean tricks, and I wouldn't done that one if I'd knowed it would make him feel that way. Chapter 16. We slept most all day and started out at night, a little ways behind a monstrous long raft that was as long going by as a procession. She had 4 long sweeps at each end, so we judged she carried as many as 30 men, likely. She had 5 big wigwams aboard, wide apart, and an open campfire in the middle, and a tall flagpole at each end. There was a power of style about her. It amounted to something being a raftsman on such a craft as that. We went drifting down into a big bend, and the night clouded up and got hot. The river was very wide and was walled with solid timber on both sides. You couldn't see a break in it hardly ever, or a light. We talked about Cairo, and wondered whether we would know it when we got to it. I said likely we wouldn't, because I had heard say there weren't but about a dozen houses there, and if they didn't happen to have them lit up, how was we going to know we was passing a town? Jim said if the two big rivers joined together there, that would show. But I said maybe we might think we was passing the foot of an island and coming into the same old river again. That disturbed Jim, and me too. So the question was, what to do? I said, paddle ashore the first time a light showed, and tell them Pap was behind, coming along with a trading scow, and was a green hand at the business, and wanted to know how far it was to Cairo. Jim thought it was a good idea, so we took a smoke on it and waited. There weren't nothing to do now but to look out sharp for the town, and not pass it without seeing it. He said he'd be mighty sure to see it, because he'd be a free man the minute he seen it. But if he missed it, he'd be in a slave country again and no more show for freedom. Every little while he jumps up and says, "Da she is?" But it weren't. It was jack-o'-lanterns or lightning bugs. So he sat down again and went to watching, same as before. Jim said it made him all over trembly and feverish to be so close to freedom. Well, I can tell you it made me all over trembly and feverish too to hear him, because I begun to get it through my head that he was most free. And who was to blame for it? Why Maine? I couldn't get that out of my conscience, no how nor no way. It got to troubling me so I couldn't rest. I couldn't stay still in one place. It hadn't ever come home to me before, what this thing was that I was doing. But now it did, and it stayed with me, and scorched me more and more. I tried to make out to myself that I weren't to blame, because I didn't run Jim off from his rightful owner. But it weren't no use. Conscience up and says, every time. But you knowed he was running for his freedom, and you could have paddled ashore and told somebody. That was so. I couldn't get around that no way. That was where it pinched. Conscience says to me, what had poor Miss Watson done to you that you could see her nigger go off right under your eyes and never say one single word? What did that poor old woman do to you that you could treat her so mean? Why, she tried to learn you your book. She tried to learn you your manners. She tried to be good to you every way she knowed how. That's what she done. I got a feeling so mean and so miserable I most wished I was dead. I fidgeted up and down the raft, abusing myself to myself, and Jim was fidgeting up and down past me. We neither of us could keep still. Every time he danced around and says, "Das Cairo," it went through me like a shot, and I thought if it was Cairo, I reckoned I would die of miserableness. Jim talked out loud all the time while I was talking to myself. He was saying how the first thing he would do when he got to a free state, he would go to saving up money and never spend a single cent, and when he got enough he would buy his wife, which was owned on a farm close to where Miss Watson lived. And then they would both work to buy the two children, and if their master wouldn't sell them, they'd get an abolitionist to go and steal them. It most froze me to hear such talk. He wouldn't ever dared to talk such talk in his life before. Just see what a difference it made in him the minute he judged he was about free. It was according to the old saying, give a nigger an inch and he'll take an L. Thinks I, this is what comes of my not thinking. Here was this nigger, which I had as good as helped to run away, coming right out flat-footed and saying he would steal his children, children that belonged to a man I didn't even know, a man that hadn't ever done me no harm. I was sorry to hear Jim say that. It was such a lowering of him. My conscience got to stirring me up hotter than ever, until at last I says to it, let up on me. It ain't too late yet. I'll paddle ashore at the first light and tell. I felt easy and happy and light as a feather right off. All my troubles was gone. I went to looking out sharp for a light and sort of singing to myself. By and by one showed. Jim sings out, "We safe, Huck, we safe. Jump up and crack your heels. That's the good old Cairo at last. I just knows it." I says, "I'll take the canoe and go and see Jim. It mightn't be, you know." He jumped and got the canoe ready and put his old coat in the bottom for me to set on and give me the paddle. And as I shoved off, he says, "Pooty soon I'll be a-shoutin' for joy, and I'll say, it's all on accounts of Huck. I's a free man, and I couldn't ever been free if it hadn't been for Huck. Huck done it. Jim won't ever forget you, Huck. You's the best friend Jim's ever had, and you's the only friend old Jim's got now." I was paddling off, all in a sweat to tell on him, but when he says this, it seemed to kind of take the tuck all out of me. I went along slow then, and I weren't right down certain whether I was glad I started or whether I warn't. When I was 50 yards off, Jim says, "Dar you goes the old true Huck, the only white gentleman that ever kept his promise to old Jim." Well, I just felt sick, but I says, "I got to do it. I can't get out of it." Right then along comes a skiff with 2 men in it with guns, and they stopped and I stopped. One of them says, "What's that yonder?" "A piece of a raft," I says. "Do you belong on it?" "Yes, sir." "Any men on it?" "Only one, sir." "Well, there's 5 niggers run off tonight up yonder, above the head of the bend. Is your man white or black?" I didn't answer up prompt. I tried to, but the words wouldn't come. I tried for a second or two to brace up and out with it, but I weren't man enough. Hadn't the spunk of a rabbit. I see I was weakening, so I just give up trying and up and says, "He's white. I reckon we'll go and see for ourselves." "I wish you would," says I, "because it's Pap that's there, and maybe you'd help me tow the raft ashore where the light is. He's sick, and so is Ma'am and Mary Ann." "Oh, the devil! We're in a hurry, boy, but I suppose we've got to. Come, buckle to your paddle, and let's get along." I buckled to my paddle, and they laid to their oars. When we had made a stroke or two, I says, "Pap'll be mighty much obleeged to you, I can tell you. Everybody goes away when I want them to help me tow the raft ashore, and I can't do it by myself." "Well, that's infernal mean. Odd, too. Say, boy, what's the matter with your father?" "It's well, it ain't anything much." They stopped pulling. It weren't but a mighty little ways to the raft now. One says, "Boy, that's a lie. What is the matter with your pap? Answer up square now, and it'll be the better for you." "I will, sir. I will, honest. But don't leave us, please. It's the gentleman. If you'll only pull ahead and let me heave you the headline, you won't have to come near the raft. Please do." "Set her back, John. Set her back," says one. They backed water. "Keep away, boy. Keep to leeward. Confound it. I just expect the wind has blowed it to us. Your pap's got the small pox, and you know it precious well. Why didn't you come out and say so? Do you want to spread it all over?" "Well," says I, blubbering, "I've told everybody before, and they just went away and left us." "Poor devil, there's something in that. We are right down sorry for you, but well, hang it. We don't want the small pox, you see. Look here, I'll tell you what to do. Don't you try to land by yourself or you'll smash everything to pieces. You float along down about 20 miles and you'll come to a town on the left-hand side of the river. It will be long after sunup then, and when you ask for help, you tell them your folks are all down with chills and fever. Don't be a fool again and let people guess what is the matter. Now we're trying to do you a kindness, so you just put 20 miles between us. That's a good boy. It wouldn't do any good to land yonder where the light is. It's only a wood yard. Say, I reckon your father's poor, and I'm bound to say he's in pretty hard luck. Here, I'll put a $20 gold piece on this board, and you get it when it floats by. I feel mighty mean to leave you, but my kingdom, it won't do to fool with smallpox, don't you see?" "Hold on, Parker," says the other man. "Here's a 20 to put on the board for me. Goodbye, boy. You do as Mr. Parker told you, and you'll be all right." "That's so, my boy. Goodbye, goodbye. If you see any runaway niggers, you get help and nab them, and you can make some money by it." "Goodbye, sir," says I. "I won't let no runaway niggers get by me if I can help it." They went off, and I got aboard the raft, feeling bad and low because I knowed very well I had done wrong, and I see it weren't no use for me to try to learn to do right. A body that don't get started right when he's little ain't got no show. When the pinch comes, there ain't nothing to back him up and keep him to his work, and so he gets beat. Then I thought a minute and says to myself, hold on. Suppose you'd have done right and give Jim up. Would you felt better than what you do now? No, says I. I'd feel bad. I'd feel just the same way I do now. Well then, says I, what's the use you learning to do right when it's troublesome to do right and ain't no trouble to do wrong, and the wages is just the same? I was stuck. I couldn't answer that. So I reckoned I wouldn't bother no more about it, but after this, always do whichever come handiest at the time. I went into the wigwam. Jim weren't there. I looked all around. He weren't anywhere. I says, Jim. Here I is, Huck. Is day out of sight yet? Don't talk loud. He was in the river under the stern oar with just his nose out. I told him they were out of sight, so he come aboard. He says, I was a-listening to all the talk, and I slips into the river on was gwine to shove for show if they come aboard. Then I was gwine to swim to the raft agin when day was gone. But lawsy, how you did fool 'em, Huck. Dat woos de smarts dodge. I tell you, Chile, I spec it save old Jim. Old Jim ain't going to forget you for dat, honey. Then we talked about the money. It was a pretty good raise, $20 apiece. Jim said we could take deck passage on a steamboat now, and the money would last us as far as we wanted to go in the free states. He said 20 mile more weren't far for the raft to go, but he wished we was already there. Towards daybreak we tied up, and Jim was mighty particular about hiding the raft good. Then he worked all day fixing things in bundles and getting all ready to quit rafting. That night about 10 we hove in sight of the lights of a town away down in a left-hand bend. I went off in the canoe to ask about it. Pretty soon I found a man out in the river with a skiff, setting a trot line. I ranged up and says, Mister, is that town Cairo? Cairo? No. You must be a blame fool. What town is it, mister? If you want to know, go and find out. If you stay here bothering around me for about a half a minute longer, you'll get something you won't want. I paddled to the raft. Jim was awful disappointed, but I said never mind. Cairo would be the next place, I reckoned. We passed another town before daylight, and I was going out again. But it was high ground, so I didn't go. No high ground about Cairo, Jim said. I had forgot it. We laid up for the day on a towhead tolerable close to the left-hand bank. I begun to suspicion something. So did Jim. I says, maybe we went by Cairo in the fog that night. He says, don't lees talk about it, Huck. Po niggers can't have no luck. I owlas expected that rattlesnake skin weren't done with its work. I wish I'd never seen that snake skin, Jim. I do wish I'd never laid eyes on it. It ain't you fault, Huck. You didn't know. Don't you blame yourself about it. When it was daylight, here was the clear Ohio water and shore, sure enough, and outside was the old regular muddy. So it was all up with Cairo. We talked it all over. It wouldn't do to take to the shore. We couldn't take the raft up the stream, of course. There weren't no way but to wait for dark and start back in the canoe and take the chances. So we slept all day amongst the cottonwood thicket so as to be fresh for the work, and when we went back to the raft about dark, the canoe was gone. We didn't say a word for a good while. There weren't anything to say. We both knowed well enough it was some more work of the rattlesnake skin. So what was the use to talk about it? It would only look like we was finding fault, and that would be bound to fetch more bad luck and keep on fetching it too, till we knowed enough to keep still. By and by we talked about what we better do, and found there weren't no way but just to go along down with the raft till we got a chance to buy a canoe to go back in. We weren't going to borrow it when there weren't anybody around, the way Pap would do, for that might set people after us. So we shoved out after dark on the raft. Anybody that don't believe yet that it's foolishness to handle a snakeskin, after all that snakeskin done for us, will believe it now if they read on and see what more it done for us. The place to buy canoes is off of rafts laying up at shore. But we didn't see no rafts laying up, so we went along during 3 hours and more. Well, the night got gray and ruther thick, which is the next meanest thing to fog. You can't tell the shape of the river, and you can't see no distance. It got to be very late and still, and then along comes a steamboat up the river. We lit the lantern and judged she would see it. Upstream boats didn't generally come close to us. They go out and follow the bars and hunt for easy water under the reefs. But nights like this, they bull right up the channel against the whole river. We could hear her pounding along, but we didn't see her good till she was close. She aimed right for us. Often they do that and try to see how close they can come without touching. Sometimes the wheel bites off a sweep and then the pilot sticks his head out and laughs and thinks he's mighty smart. Well, here she comes, and we said she was going to try and shave us, but she didn't seem to be shearing off a bit. She was a big one, and she was coming in a hurry too, looking like a black cloud with rows of glowworms around it. But all of a sudden she bulged out, big and scary, with a long row of wide-open furnace doors shining like red-hot teeth, and her monstrous bows and guards hanging right over us. There was a yell at us, and a jingling of bells to stop the engines, a powwow of cussing and whistling of steam, and as Jim went overboard on one side and I on the other, she come smashing straight through the raft. I dived, and I aimed to find the bottom too, for a 30-foot wheel had got to go over me, and I wanted it to have plenty of room. I could always stay underwater a minute. This time I reckon I stayed under a minute and a half. Then I bounced for the top in a hurry, for I was nearly busting. I popped out to my armpits and blowed the water out of my nose and puffed a bit. Of course there was a booming current, and of course that boat started her engines again 10 seconds after she stopped them, for they never cared much for raftsmen. So now she was churning along up the river, out of sight in the thick weather, though I could hear her. I sung out for Jim about a dozen times, but I didn't get any answer, so I grabbed a plank that touched me while I was treading water and struck out for shore, shoving it ahead of me. But I made out to see that the drift of the current was towards the left-hand shore, which meant that I was in a crossing, so I changed off and went that way. It was one of these long, slanting 2-mile crossings, so I was a good long time in getting over. I made a safe landing and clumb up the bank. I couldn't see but a little ways, but I went poking along over rough ground for a quarter of a mile or more, and then I run across a big, old-fashioned double log house before I noticed it. I was going to rush by and get away, but a lot of dogs jumped out and went to howling and barking at me, and I knowed better than to move another peg.